Art isn't like everything else. It's unique in its very nature, the creation of both body and mind, and perhaps some soul thrown in for good measure. From a young age, so many of us make our first marks to accolades, and then it begins. We start creating things to make our parents smile, to get a piece hung on the fridge, to show our grandparents or our teachers, to display our emotions. Maybe it escalates, and your art becomes a journaling method. Maybe you sell a couple pieces here and there. Maybe you end up taking classes and a teacher tells you what to make, or maybe gives you the freedom to make whatever you want. At the end of the day, so many pieces of our culture push you to make art for someone else's purpose, if they push you to make it at all. And there is nothing wrong with this, but there is something lost, if this is the only reason that you make your art. In today's day and age, the word selfish gets thrown around perhaps a little too hastily. First of all, taking care of yourself, which often gets thrown in the same bin, is not a bad thing. But also, it's not selfish to make something simply because you want to. Well, my name is Zach, and welcome to episode 83 of the podcast. Today, we are discussing making art for yourself, and hopefully a bunch of strange things that come from that. As usual, I'm going to explore what I mean by the topic and then go over some of how this might actually impact you as an artist, and then unpack my personal thoughts at the end. Feel free to check out the Discord and Patreon linked below as well. So as we get started, what percentage of your artwork is done for you specifically versus practice, class, commissions, etc.? Let me know in the comments below and I'll talk about my take on it personally at the end. So why talk about making art for yourself in the first place? For some of you, this might seem silly, like that's what art is by its nature. It's a thing that you make to feel better, that is fun, that is an exploration, a reinvestigation into being a child. But for others, and often without them knowing, it has become some version of work. Real quick, I want to clarify some cases where I think art is being made not for yourself, or at least not exclusively for yourself. Art made in the pursuit of getting better, i.e. practice. Practice is generally for something else, an extraneous purpose. It can be for the potential pushing of your own artwork, but I would classify practice and studying as not being art for your personal sake. Assignments for classes also fit in this category. When someone gives you an assignment, even if it's a class you're taking of your own accord, it is not making art for yourself. Perhaps it is being made for your own benefit, but I would not classify this as art being made for yourself. Commissions obviously fit into this for exactly the same reasons. Someone else is determining the pieces, the projects, how they're coming together, maybe even the time frame. Work to put up on a wall. Even if you're working on something to put up in your own apartment or home, this could fall into that category. It has an extraneous purpose. You're thinking about how other people are going to look at it when they come in. Gifts for other people. Obviously, like commissions, when you're working on something for someone else, there are other factors that come in, so it's not exclusively art done for yourself. It could even be to fill a sketchbook arbitrarily, or finish out some canvases that you have lying around. If you are doing that, then you're not working on the art solely because you want to be working on it. Now, there is nothing wrong with any of these, but at least in my mind, there is a secondary purpose and often a different primary purpose for each of them, and that mucks up the metrics a bit. If you think differently, I'd love to hear about it below. And again, there's nothing wrong with making art for any of those purposes, but I think in almost all cases, if we're really being honest with ourselves, you're not making those kinds of art specifically for yourself. Okay, so why/how do you make art just for yourself? Like, why is this important? I suppose I should take just a moment and talk about this. Obviously, I was an art teacher for quite a long time. I now make art videos on YouTube and instructional content as well. I have work in a gallery here in town that gives you kind of an idea of what I'm doing. Ironically, in all of those cases, I wouldn't necessarily be comfortable categorizing that art as art for myself. Ironically, the work that I do and took into the gallery when I first got in was, but now the paintings that I put together are being put together specifically with a thought of what will do well here, what will sell, what will look good as it's hanging on the wall. Obviously, the artwork that I did while I was teaching was primarily geared towards what's best for these kids, what's going to help them grow the most. And if I'm going to be teaching them things, I need to be practicing those same things as well. And then even the content that I work on for the videos here, but I will talk about that at the end of this session. When I sit down to work on art that is truly just for me, often the topics are going to be the same as the ones that you see in my videos. They're going to be robots and dragons and world building stuff. And so you're seeing tidbits of that in my content. But the stuff that I do truly for myself is pretty much never recorded because I want to erase that extra level of stress and anxiety that comes with having to have something under a camera, worry about if my lighting is correct, where any of those extraneous worries are going to take away from my joy and fulfillment. And I think that is going to move us pretty nicely into why it's beneficial to make art just for yourself, the art that you want to make, without necessarily considering how other people are going to think about it, even necessarily how future you is going to think about it. The first of these is it's fun and it makes your life better. Art for most of us is about joy at a fundamental level. If you never enjoy making art, then the chances are that you won't stick with it, or it will become something like a career. I do know some artists who work professionally, but they do it because they're good at it as opposed to something that they really enjoy. This is similar to a lot of the engineers in my life. I've got several electrical, chemical, and mechanical engineers in my life, and most of them don't really enjoy the jobs they do. They're just good at those things. They're really proficient at those particular skills associated with that craft. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. At some level, you have to earn enough money to be able to put food on the table. But if you find no joy or satisfaction in your art and you do it professionally, or you strive to do it professionally, you will probably end up in that same realm. But for most of us, art is fun at a base level. And maybe you've lost some of that over the years. Maybe you got into it in high school or afterwards because it was so enjoyable. And then you kind of bought into this lie that you need to be, working on anatomy. You need to be working on perspective. You need to be working on all these things. And don't get me wrong, I think growth and continual growth for artists is generally a given. Most of us have a desire or a need to get better, but that getting better should always be in service to something else, not in service to itself. If you're working on artwork that is only for the sake of getting better so that you're better, it's nothing. That's hollow. And it's fun and enjoyable to make the things that you want to make. So it's really easy to fall into this trap, to make things for the purpose of getting better. And at the end of the day, I think it's important for all of us to dive back into making art just for ourselves because it's fun. Maybe I want to pontificate. In fact, I feel myself kind of leaning that way. Like, how can I make this really sophisticated? But I don't think that it really needs to be. Like, art is supposed to be fun to some degree. Yes, it gives us the ability to record a particular moment in time, to communicate things to other people, maybe to advocate for something that you find very important, to tell the story that is, true to you and dear to your soul. But at the end of the day, all of that should be fun, at least at some level. And even if you work professionally or your goal is to build up your skills over time to become professional, if you don't engage in the fun side of art, you won't be able to stick with it long enough for any of that to matter. And so engaging in the fun, the joy of art is always going to be a worthwhile experience, a worthwhile venture. So that's the first reason here, is just it's fun. It makes your life better to work on art that is just for yourself. The second is it's reinvigorating if you are struggling with burnout or creative block. This is something I think that many of us run into at certain points. I don't necessarily hit the creative block very frequently, but I did just hit a little bit of creative burnout last week. In fact, I'm still kind of recovering from that. This is April 22nd when I'm recording this session right now, and I'm slowly kind of coming out of it. Every day I'm getting a little bit more rest, and I'm kind of recuperating, though today is going to be a long one, so we shall see how this goes. But for me, if I am trying to work on art for videos, if I'm trying to work on art for instruction or art for the gallery, and I am struggling, with a little bit of burnout, maybe the last week has been exhausting, whether it's physical or mental burnout, that's really, really, really difficult to engage in. And it kind of causes me to subconsciously push against making art in the first place. So when I am in that position, if I engage with art that is just for me. If I sit down and I draw some goofy robots or some eldritch horror or something, that is really invigorating. It's almost like giving myself this easy win. If I sit down and just make a goofy little drawing for 5, 10, 15 minutes and it turns out, fine and it's cute and it's goofy, that situation is beneficial to me. It kind of boosts maybe it is my confidence. That's what I was going to say, obviously. But maybe it is confidence boosting in that moment. It kind of sets me back on the right track. I feel like I have a teeny bit of momentum. And I've seen that be the case for many, many other artists as well. If you've worked yourself to the bone, especially if you're, trying to finish up a class, a commission, or a project for work, and then you take just a little bit of time after that and you engage in something that is purely for yourself, it can be incredibly reinvigorating. And we need that. I wish that we as artists were better about kind of keeping things in stasis, holding to that Aristotelian mean, but most of us are really bad at that. Most of us have these wild swings of big flares of creativity for a time, and then we have to step away from it. It would be lovely if we were more by nature able to just stick to a thing and do it, but that doesn't seem to be the case for most of us. If that's you, I am so happy that is the case, because for me, it's not. I want to draw a little bit every day, and I struggle to do this tremendously. The only creative activity I do every day is my writing, and even right now, I'm hitting the point where I get to 9 o'clock at night, and it's time to sit down and do my writing for the day, and I am just tired and don't want to. And I do have a little bit of a worry about pushing myself there. Like, is this going to turn out well? Am I just going to end up editing the crap out of this later? And I don't know. But I do know that I'm almost at the finish line for this book, and my plan is literally to focus just on the things that I like to make for myself for a month after I finish the novel. So I'm going to be world building, I'm going to be coming up with languages, I'm going to be brainstorming all kinds of stuff, writing short stories rather than working on this big epic. And it's exactly what I'm doing to hopefully reinvigorate myself and get myself excited to go back in and finish the third novel, starting hopefully the first part of June. But this is one of the biggest reasons I would encourage you as an artist to work on stuff that is just for you periodically, and work this into kind of your rotation, whatever kind of haphazard rotation you might have. It helps with that struggle of burnout. But it can also help with creative block as well. If you've been working on a lot of things that are more obligatory or arbitrary in your artistic life, if you take some time to just work on stuff that you want to, where there's very little in the way of expectations, there's not as much pressure put on yourself, you will probably unhinge like some of those things that are starting to get gunked up. Think of it like a series of gears that have just kind of ground up and they don't want to work. They're all like gunked up with junk and whatnot. Maybe they're starting to rust. Well, the working on the art just for yourself is like applying some WD-40 or some oil to that mess of metal. And all of those components can start working a little bit more fluidly. Now, obviously, you're going to have to jump in probably and refinish those things that are stressing you out and they're creating that pressure. But if you have pressure always being applied to any mechanical thing, ourselves and our minds included, it's just not going to go well. You've got to have a little bit of time with a break. So maybe think of your art just for yourself as being like the WD-40 or the oil that helps any engine continue to work forever, or close to it. The next thing is, remember, it's the reason that you practiced. If you've been putting a ton of hard work into practice, into studying, into learning new things artistically, why? Generally, so you can do the things that you find fulfilling, fun, and joy-filled, which is the art that you want to do just for yourself. All of the hard work, the struggles, the studies, what are they for? At a base level, they're for this, for re-engaging in the stuff that you really enjoy. Whatever it is that you wanted to practice likely ties into the art that you want to make for yourself in the first place, so go ahead and allow yourself that time. Now, one of the big counterpoints here is you could be sitting there going, well, I've been practicing anatomy for a long time so that I can create these characters, and if I'm not good enough at creating them, then any of the art that I work on for myself is either unsatisfying or it's just not efficient. You might be correct there, and I've taught myself that same thing, or told myself that same thing over the years. Like, I need to study characters more rather than design my own. And the reality is, like, that's just not true. If you look at so many of the cartoons, especially Western cartoons, like some of them have very strange, aesthetic styles. And like some of the characters are not particularly well drawn if you want to look at it, more objectively. And it doesn't really matter. Like there are characters that are not well drawn in a lot of TV shows that are still super interesting. I've been watching some lore recently on Adventure Time, and a lot of the characters in that series are just like not complicated. They're not well drawn in kind of aesthetically pleasing way. Like there's not a lot of anatomy to Finn and how his arms kind of wave around all noodly, and especially Jake. So it's not that important. It is important, but if your goal is to draw characters, if we're going to go down this same, hypothetical idea, just start drawing them now. Like intersperse your practice with stuff that's just for yourself, working out these characters. It'll kind of be cool over the course of months. You'll get to see them evolve, but you'll also notice the things that you really want to work on. You might notice, for example, that you're doing just fine with faces, but you need to practice the hands because fingers are, so terribly difficult to work on until you really grasp them. And I'm still not sure that I have. There's a reason that a lot of my robots have these weird things that they have. I also tend to draw everything from the side as you're watching happening in the background. That's my happy place. And you're probably the same if you haven't specifically worked on something else. And so maybe start working on some of those characters from the side and from 3/4 angles and things like that. But working on that art just for yourself, interspersed within the stuff that you're studying, is not only going to be like the most efficient way to do it, because it points you in the right direction, it tells you what you need to do, it allows you to evaluate what you're learning and how it's applicable, but it's going to allow you to stay with it for way longer. And it's literally the purpose. So if you are practicing a specific skill and you're just dedicated to it, take some breaks here and there and work on the stuff that's just for yourself, the things that all of this is building toward. I am going to be striving to do the same thing here as well. I'm starting to actually work on character designs for my book, and hopefully I'll start working on them for the robotic story that I've been, writing music for 2 decades now, I guess. And I'll start building all that stuff out. So I'm going to start making bad character drawings, which hopefully will then point me in the direction of the good character drawings and the things I need to work on. But always come back to working on the stuff that is just for you, the stuff that got you into this in the first place, especially if you're practicing a lot. Come back to why you were practicing in the first place. This next one is something that has kind of accidentally been touched on over the course of the last couple, and that's the fact that when you work on art that's just for yourself, it allows you to stay in the art longer. Now, on a cursory level, this makes total sense, but I think it's also broadly applicable to whatever your pursuit is in art. I want to attack this in 2 ways, though. The first part is the fact that if this is all you do, that's totally fine and satisfactory. So if all of your art ever is done just for your own sake, because you enjoy making it, you like looking back at it later, whatever it is, that's totally fine. For a lot of us, that's not the case. There are other pieces, there are other things that come out of that. Some of them are based in traumas and background and those kind of things. Some of them are based on just this itch that you have to, work with. You have to create worlds. You have to bring this story to life. But if you are that number 1 category there where you just work on art for your own satisfaction and joy, that is wonderful and justifiable. And, if anybody ever tells you different, like, why are you putting this time in it? It's just like, thumb your nose at them. It doesn't matter. Every human needs to work on something or needs to have a hobby or some downtime. And, I know American culture kind of pushes against that sometimes, but it's all bunk. Like, just forget it all. So if that's you, you're fine. Most of us, I feel, fit into a second category, though, which is you want to accomplish something with your art. You want to get better so you can do X, Y, and Z. I've talked about a lot of examples before. I'm not going to, kind of go over a bunch of them here. But if you are in that second category, which is where most of us fit, it's where I fit, then coming back to something that brings you joy intrinsically, it keeps you in that race longer. And it is a race. Generally, it's not a race against time or other people. It's a race against ourselves. We want to get better. We want to improve. We want to bring these things to life that have been eating away at the back of our mind for the last couple decades. There's nothing wrong with that. That's an intrinsically human thing. Not all humans have it, but many, many do. And if that's you, I would encourage you, Take some time periodically to come back to the things that you enjoy and make art specifically just for yourself. It will keep you from burning out better than most things will artistically. It'll keep you in it. Whereas this is also a good strategy, like I mentioned earlier, to pull yourself out of burnout, to ease the pressure of creative block and those kinds of things. It's also a good preventative measure. This will help avoid that, either ever occurring, or it will simply stave it off so that it occurs much less frequently. I find this is incredibly true in my life. If I up the percentage of how much time I'm putting into the art that's just for me, it takes me a much, much longer time to burn out or to become tired or to unconsciously push away at my artwork. So this is a huge one, and I think it's a really good beneficial thing. The next one is the artwork is often more emotional. This is going to be a bigger benefit for some people versus others, but I think in general it's a good thing. Storytelling elements are a very frequently occurring component of artwork in general, and emotion is really beneficial in that pursuit. And if you make art that's just for you, it's generally pulling from different places in your psyche than art that is geared towards something else. I know for me, if I'm making a piece that is specifically to be recorded, to be shared with others, I'm thinking about the other humans and how they're going to take that on, how it's going to come across to them. But if I'm making something for myself, often that's when I get the artwork that's yes, I'm struggling this week and this piece feels very anxiety induced. And sometimes that can be really, really cathartic. But it can also be really good when I'm trying to share something with someone else. If I work on writing that is just for me, or even my little drawings that are just for me, those things are often better at communicating emotion than the stuff that is strategically built to do that. Which seems counterintuitive perhaps, but I find that it's often true. This is also one of the reasons why I think poetry is perhaps the truest form of written art. It gives the ability to, see into the window of a human soul better than I think any other kind of writing. It's succinct. It's often done off the cuff. Because it's so small, it often doesn't get a whole lot of revision. It's something that just kind of pours out and you get this little encapsulated moment of a human soul. And I value poetry tremendously for this reason because, I can read 8 or 10 or 25 lines of a poem in a single breath almost. I love Lord of the Rings. There are so many wonderful moments throughout all of it, but often a poem will encapsulate my love and affection for a thing better than my favorite novels will. And it's this strange thing. And poetry is so often born from emotion. And so if you allow yourself periodically to just work on artwork that is for you, there's a higher chance of it being poetry in artistic form. Something that will more adequately capture emotion from you or communicate emotion to other people. And if for no other reason, it's worth engaging in that sometimes, to take a break from the obligatory, arbitrary stuff and to work on something that is just distinctly for you. Another aspect is this kind of engagement keeps you balanced as an artist. I mentioned earlier that artists kind of struggle. We go up and down. We, very intensely work on our artwork for 6 weeks, and then for 6 more weeks, we do no artwork. It's very common. Doing this will allow you to be more balanced. This might allow you to stay with it for longer. It might allow you to stave off burnout and creative block and such things. But in general, it will just help balance you out. Whatever it is that you do all the time, you can be balanced better by doing something that is different. The funny part here, though, is if you are that category I talked about earlier, who is the artist who makes art always for themselves, you might be okay. You might not need to balance that by doing the other side of things. You might be okay just making art for yourself forever. But that's not all of us. In fact, I don't believe that's most of us. I think most of us are that other side. And so if I'm right, and most of us artists are working on improving, growing, trying to build something, we're dissatisfied with our skills, yada, 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 it is going to be beneficial for us to balance ourselves by working on things periodically that are just for us. I mention Aristotle every once in a while on this channel, and specifically I mention the Aristotelian mean, which is this idea that the good life, that truth, kind of exists between two extremes. It's the median between those, the mean of those, right? So if you've got the crazy excess of only ever making art totally for yourself and only ever making art for other people. Seeking balance in the middle of that for most of us is going to be the best way to do things. The counterpoint here, and I'm really curious about your thoughts, so if you want to leave them below, is I'm not sure that if you make art just for yourself, that anything needs to be added or modified. I'm not 100% sure why I think that, but I have this inclination that if you are one of those unique people who can just work on art because you want to, because it makes your life better, and you never really feel the pressure to push yourself and to do, greater things and to practice and become more proficient, or however this kind of articulates itself in your personal life, I just have this faint notion that you might just be okay. It's like the person who gardens because they love flowers and they love gardening. Like, they're not necessarily running themselves into the ground trying to make their tomatoes more productive than last year's. But I'm not sure. It's just there's a lot of thoughts bouncing around in this head. So I'd love to know your thoughts if you have anything that is, supporting, or especially if it's contradictory to what I'm thinking. Working on art that is just for yourself as well helps remind you what the purpose of art really is. Now, I could take a lot of time and try to pontificate and discuss what the, overarching purpose of art is. How many papers and essays over the years have been written on this topic, I could not even hope to guess. People take very strong stances of this is the specific purpose of art. It is to communicate something about the human condition to another human who is not the specific artist. And some might take a very soft stance of, there is no true purpose to art. It is whatever it means to you. I rather dislike this latter category because I think that we often understand a topic more fully when we sit down and try to define things, even if they aren't necessarily definable. I think that struggle is often something that produces a better, true understanding of a topic. And so I like to engage in it. As I am now much older than I used to be, I don't play devil's advocate nearly as much, but I try to just be open when I'm having those discussions with people and be like, look, I don't know, but what if this? Which is probably a little bit kinder than, when I was young, where it's like, I'm just playing devil's advocate, just like every, awesome dude who ever did that makes you real popular, doesn't it? So hopefully that's one of the burrs that's been sanded off as I got a little bit older. But there is a purpose in your art. And because this is centered on you, I'm totally content kind of taking that softer approach. Each of us has a specific thing that we get out of our art, a purpose that the art serves in our own lives, if you will. And when you work on art that's just for yourself, you cannot help but engage in that component, because that's literally what you're doing in that moment. So if for you art is soothing, then going back and working on art just for yourself is going to remind you of that, remind you that it is a mechanism that you can use to self-soothe. If the art is fulfilling and satisfying, you feel good and successful when you've accomplished something, working on it just for yourself reminds you of those aspects. It reminds you that it can be that tool. When you feel a lack of confidence, when you had a tough day at work, when somebody ragged on you a lot at the cash register because they just forget that, people that work at stores are humans too, you can work on that art at home and remind yourself that you are a valid human being. You have valid concerns, that your perspective is relevant. Coming back and working on art that is specifically for you reminds you what purpose that art serves in your life. And this is something that's really important because we tend to get focused, hyper-focused even, on a particular aspect of our art, and we spend a lot of time there, and then we can lose track of where we wanted to be, where we wanted to go, where we were. All of these things kind of fall away. This seems to be a pretty common trait in most artists. So working on art just for yourself can be really helpful in reminding you of what purpose that art serves in your life. Well, what are my thoughts on the topic? I said earlier I would talk about my artwork and what amount is done for me specifically as far as, all of the work I do, across the channel and those kind of things. Honestly, it's a weird mix. Most of the work I do for these videos are, kind of things that I want to make, but the recording influences that a bit. Primarily in when I make it and how I make it. Little things like I have to be working flat on a table and I have to be downstairs in my studio and I can only work on it in one orientation, even though Frankly, when I'm working on my art by myself, I will move my sketchbook around a ton to get at better angles for things. Sometimes the lines I make in my video are not the best version of those lines I could make because I'd have to rotate my canvas a whole bunch, and that would just make the video quite awkward. I honestly have a lot of drawings I have not finished because I know I need to work on them while I'm recording, and that hampers things. In fact, there are probably some drawings that, 6 months later, I'll look at it and go like, I don't even remember where the original video file for this is. I'm just going to finish the drawing now. And that's kind of freeing. But I have, at this point, I think I have 4 or 5 drawings in my sketchbook that are either halfway through or they're sketched out and I want to work on them, but I know that they would make a good recording, and so I'm holding off. But it's a different place in my brain. I can happily sit at my dining room table and work on a drawing any time of day and be happy and satisfied. But it feels like work to bring it downstairs and to work on it here, and I've got other concerns, and it's like the space isn't the greatest. I like working on giant tables in my studio, though I'm very grateful for it. It is quite small and quite cramped because I have too many hobbies and too many artistic forms that I work on. So I would guess maybe 25% of my work is done solely for me, with the rest being instructive, paintings for the gallery, drawing with my daughter, or something else along those lines. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I feel like at my age, it's probably okay for the percentage to be there. Kind of idealistically, I wish it was higher. I wish that 50% of the art I was working on was just for me, but that doesn't seem totally practical. I'm okay to be dedicated toward making sure that, I'm improving so that I can do the things I want to do in the near future. But I think it would probably be dangerous to dip below 25%. If I draw for 5 hours a week, that means that's going to make the math harder. If I draw 4 hours a week, which hopefully I draw more than that, one of those hours should be unfilmed and just dedicated to me, just dedicated to the art that I want to produce. And so I think that's probably a good benchmark, but I'm not totally sure. But as for my thoughts on making art for yourself, it's probably the most noble thing you can do artistically and the most fundamentally human. I talk about this a lot because in my life, I've only got a few people who really work on their art just because they want to, just because it's good for them. And they are often the people who are most satisfied with their art. They're often the people who are filled with joy in the rest of their life. And I do think that there's something noble about just working on the stuff you want to work on. I don't find it selfish, and maybe it is in the broadest sense of the definition, but we kind of need to take another look at the word selfish, because all humans are selfish. I mean, you have to be selfish. If you were totally unselfish, you would forget to feed yourself and things like that, and that's not good. If you are a very selfless person who likes to take care of other people, you have to take care of yourself to a certain degree so you're still a resource to those people. So it's, if you run into a person who's self-centered, I think that's very different than somebody who is, selfish with a portion of their time. I'm quite selfish. I work against it in certain aspects. Sometimes when I'm sitting there working on something and my daughter wants to play, I don't want to play in that moment, but my daughter's 5. I'm not going to have an eternity with her living at home. She is the priority over my needs in that moment, over my desires in that moment. And so I take care of her. I put my stuff to the side and I'm selfless for a couple minutes. But I'm also, I'm probably not the good benchmark. I work against my selfishness all the time. But I have most of the people in my life who I feel like are overly selfless. And so I often encourage them, look out for yourself, please. That's one of the best ways you can take care of other people, is making sure you're actually a resource for them in the long term. But yeah, that's kind of my take on this, my thoughts. If you are one of those people who can work on art just for yourself, bravo. I think it's probably the most noble way to work on art. Well, as always, thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. I hope this was beneficial. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below if you haven't already left them. Thank you to my patrons as well who are on the screen right now. If you want to check out my Patreon, it is linked below along with the Discord server. The Discord server is totally free. It just gives you access to our little community we're building. The Patreon gives you access to some videos that are exclusive, the ability to vote on upcoming content, sometimes to see the scripts and the outlines of things. Mostly it gives you a way to support what I do here at the channel. So if you're enjoying it, consider, but no pressure. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.